Well, I would like to begin by thanking Joe and the Center for Mark Twain Studies for the invitation to come give this lecture, along with the opportunity, of course, to stay for 2 weeks at Quarry Farm. In fact, much of the material that I will present today is based on work that I began 3 years ago during that week-long retreat at Quarry Farm. After the quadrennial, I was one of a small group that was allowed to stay for an extra week in Elmira to work on our Twain papers under the supervision of John Bird. Never before have I had such a pleasant and impactful experience at an Authors Society conference, and I've been to many of them. I just came back, in fact, from the Dickinson conference in Taiwan, and yet, nonetheless, this was the most impactful. And I really sincerely acknowledge that this week, or that week was integral in my becoming a Twain scholar. So in a real sense, I wouldn't be here today if it were not for that first time at Quarry Farm. The title of my lecture this evening is Beyond Mental Telegraphy, Twain's Late Psychological Fiction. As the title suggests, my primary interest in Twain is his invocation of psychological themes throughout his writing. Though recently I've been more interested in his later works, like Pudd'n'head Wilson and Those Extraordinary Twins and Number 44, The Mysterious Stranger. My time at Quarry Farm will focus on the latter, so if I were giving this talk in 2 weeks, it would be very different. But tonight what I want to emphasize are the moves that Twain makes in Pudd'n'head Wilson, and especially the appended text, Those Extraordinary Twins, and how they express and experiment with psychological topics. I understand that just last week you had an excellent talk on Pudd'n'head Wilson from Eliza Theus, and I'm grateful to her for providing an impressive overview of the plot, the revisions, and some of the scholarly reception of the text. And if you're watching online, I encourage you to watch her talk before you watch this one. But whereas Eliza was primarily discussing the detective plot and the racial themes of Pudd'n'head Wilson, I focus instead on Those Extraordinary Twins and the fact that Twain continued to conjoin that story with the published text of Pudd'n'head Wilson, even despite his claims to have removed it via the literary Caesarean operation. Of course he did this for the money. He was going bankrupt at the time, after all. But I argue that Those Extraordinary Twins functions as more than just a cash grab for Twain. Rather, it served as a site to experiment with some significant psychological themes from the century. But first, some background on the story. Twain had long been fascinated by conjoined twins, having written Personal Habits of the Siamese Twins in 1869 about the famous Siamese twins Chang and Ing. The more immediate sources for the conjoined Italian brothers Angelo and Luigi from Those Extraordinary Twins, however, are the Tocci twins, a pair of conjoined twins from Italy who toured the United States beginning in 1891. Unlike Chang and Ing, who possessed largely independent bodies while being conjoined at the waist, the Tocci twins had only independent torsos while sharing a single set of legs. In Those Extraordinary Twins, Angelo and Luigi are similarly conjoined. Beyond this initial similarity, or what Henry James would call the germ of the idea, Twain proliferates twinship throughout the story. For one thing, in Pudd'n'head Wilson, Angelo and Luigi are not conjoined, but rather near-identical singleton twins. So, the Angelo and Luigi of Pudd'n'head Wilson are themselves twinned by their iterations in Those Extraordinary Twins. And this holds true for all of the characters. For example, David Wilson, the titular Pudd'n'head of the larger drama, is not exactly the same David Wilson as Those Extraordinary Twins, nor are any of the characters. They are near identical, but distinctive characters. The two versions of the story, the so-called drama and farce, are another form of twinship in the text. In many cases, Those Extraordinary Twins even relies on marginal notes about Pudd'n'head Wilson to fill its plot. I'll say more about this later. And Twain even doubles himself, writing himself into the story as a named author, as he purports to describe his writing and revision process. When in the preface to Those Extraordinary Twins, Twain describes, quote, a man who is not born with the novel-writing gift, who has a troublesome time of it when he tries to build a novel. He's jesting, but he's also making his writerly persona a character in the tale. Twain, the author, is thus distinct from Twain, the writer. And of course, in Pudd'n'head Wilson, much of the plot revolves around the two characters, Tom and Chambers, who are identical enough to switch at birth, despite one being white and the other being born to an enslaved woman. All of these instances of twinning in the text, I want to suggest, point to another twinned pair, the dual hemispheres of the human brain. While the anatomy of the brain had been known since antiquity, it was around the 19th century that theories of the mind began to seek correspondence with the physical structure of the brain. If the brain consists of two near-identical hemispheres, might this suggest that each brain contains two minds? Instances of so-called double consciousness, what we would today call multiple personality disorder, only serve to corroborate these ideas, as it was suggested that each personality might be housed in a different hemisphere of the brain. When it was discovered that the primary tools for both language comprehension and speech are housed in the left hemisphere, that became the so-called rational hemisphere, and there was more suspicion cast upon the apparently silent right hemisphere. Thus, in the 19th century, the fear was that the right hemisphere might be a subliminal personality, a brute brain, or even, at worst, an evil mind that had to be kept in check by the left hemisphere. Twinned characters, I want to suggest, provide the ideal material to fictionalize these theories with two distinct and often even opposed personalities, as we'll see with Angelo and Luigi. Now, I understand it may seem like quite a leap to go from twinned characters to the hemispheres of the brain, but there are two pieces of evidence to suggest that Twain would be particularly interested in exploring brain science and psychology while he was working on Pudd'n'head Wilson. First is his membership in the Society for Psychical Research, an organization devoted to exploring unusual phenomena beyond the realm of institutional psychological research. The SPR conducted experiments into seances, ghost sightings, and even telepathy, and it was the latter topic that first interested Twain. His letter accepting the invitation to join the SPR in 1885, in fact, detailed his interest in thought-transference, or what he called mental telegraphy. Twain continued to be an active member of this organization until 1902. The second piece of evidence is Twain's budding friendship with the famed Harvard psychologist and SPR founding member, William James, author of the influential Principles of Psychology in 1890. They first met in the winter of 1892 while they were both staying in Florence, Italy. Writing to one of his Harvard colleagues, James said, quote, "Mark Twain is here for the winter in a villa outside the town, hard at work writing something or other. I've seen him a couple times." Part of the something or other happened to be Pudd'n'head Wilson, a first draft of which Twain completed before he left Florence in 1893. Although no record of their conversation remains, it just seems obvious to me that two active members of the SPR would have drifted into psychological topics. Moreover, Twain departed Florence with a copy of James's psychology textbook, most likely the abridged psychology briefer course that had been newly published that year. Now, both of these pieces of evidence are inconclusive. Eliza would call them circumstantial, rightly. But they inspire a rereading of Pudd'n'head Wilson, and especially those extraordinary twins, not as just a cash grab or a poorly revised text, but rather as a site of experimentation. I argue that by playing with themes of twinship, conjoinment, and entanglement in the text, especially at a time when he was increasingly interested in psychical and psychological research, Twain experiments in narrative form with 19th century theories of the double brain, the relationship between the cerebral hemispheres, and ultimately, its effect on reading and interpretation. Now, when one thinks about Twain and psychical research, the most obvious piece of writing is the 1891 essay, Mental Telegraphy. Here, Twain details his decade-long investigation into what he calls curious coincidences that he argues are not merely accidental. He focuses on the phenomenon of crossed letters, where two correspondents inadvertently write to each other simultaneously, which Twain blames on the mental telegraph, or the wireless mental inspiration shared by both of the correspondents' minds. His great discovery, in his words, is that the mind can act upon mind in a quite detailed and elaborate way over vast stretches of land and water. The gist of Twain's research is that two brains can communicate wirelessly, and further, that science should work to develop an apparatus to facilitate this communication without the need for pesky language. We must have the thought itself shot into our minds from a distance, Twain proposes. Then, if we need to put it into words, we can do that tedious work at our leisure. Wordless communication and greater efficiency are thus the foundation of mental telegraphy's efficacy, and these are precisely the features that are embodied in Twain's fictional conjoined twins. The wordless efficiency of Angelo and Luigi is best on display during their first breakfast in Dawson's Landing, Missouri, having just arrived late the night before. The host family, still reeling from the shock of meeting the conjoined twins, sit dazed as they witness the brothers feeding coffee and potatoes into each other's mouths. The twins had particular tastes. Angelo cannot stomach coffee, for instance. so it was perplexing to see his hand pick up a cup of it. When Aunt Patsy Cooper can no longer maintain polite conversation with such a sight, Luigi explains, "We are always helping each other that way. It is a great economy for us both. It saves time and labor. We have a system of signs which nobody can notice or understand but ourselves. If I'm using both my hands and want some coffee, I make the sign, and Angelo furnishes it to me. And you saw, when he needed a potato, I delivered it." Neither twin clarifies the substance of the system of signs, which could be some internal sensation, some inaudible noise, or another physical action, but it clearly registers as wordless and immediate, just like mental telegraphy. Moreover, the twins admit that this communication, along with their conjoined bodies generally, provides for them a great economy. Their four hands are simply more efficient than singletons with two. With their conjoined figure, Angelo and Luigi have discovered many ways to gain an economic advantage over their singleton peers. During their travels, for instance, the twins often leverage their conjoined body to save money on facilities and accommodations. In his letter to the SPR discussing mental telegraphy, Twain claims to have saved 50 cents by depending on the mental telegraph rather than using the electric one. Similarly, the twins depend on their body while staying in European hotels where they pay half since beds are rented separately. In almost all cases, their physical form provides savings. Both of us get a bath for one ticket, theater seat for one ticket, pew rent is on the same basis, only needing to pay double at peep shows. As Luigi argues, this situation is not only practical and economical, but it is also of the extremest value for its efficiency. On Mississippi riverboats, for instance, the dining room is organized into two separate time slots, but Angelo and Luigi, by reserving the same table in adjoining slots, can more casually enjoy their meal. Now, Luigi clarifies they don't break the rules, neither of us eats anything at the other's table, but just simply works. Thus, you see, there are four hands to feed Angelo and the same four to feed me. Each of us eats 2 meals. With their four hands and nonverbal communication system, the twins can eat quicker than singletons, thus realizing a savings of time and effort in the dining room. Now, I want to argue that with this emphasis on efficiency, Twain points to 19th century understandings of the brain and what we call localization, or the idea that certain regions of the brain are responsible for particular actions, thoughts, and emotions. Localization is the foundation for 20th and 21st century neuroscience, but in the 19th century, it was, let's say, a more nebulous zone of discovery. Early experiments with bird brains, for instance, suggested that there was no separation of function between the two hemispheres of the brain. But by the middle of the century, new research on mammals provided the first clues for what we now know about brain localization. In 1870, Gustav Frisch and Eduard Hitzig discovered that specialized movements in dogs were localized to only one hemisphere, with action on one side of the body corresponding to brain activity on the opposite hemisphere. William James later corroborates this view with his discussion of the so-called motor zone of the brain. He explains that electrical currents applied to this zone would stimulate movement throughout the body. These movements affect almost invariably the side opposite to the brain irritations. If the left hemisphere be excited, the movement is of the right leg, side of face, etc. Well, the 21st century brain imaging has much more accurately, mapped specific regions of the brain responsible for actions and emotions. James's summary remains essentially correct. Localization makes the brain more efficient at performing tasks, especially dual attention tasks, like picking up morsels of food while also being aware of potential dangers in the environment. Even without the precise knowledge that neuroscience offers today, Twain represents Angelo and Luigi as dual attention par excellence. They can eat and drink more efficiently than their singleton peers because their actions are more localized. In this way, each twin resembles the division of labor between the brain's hemispheres. Twain highlights this cooperative division of labor in his noteworthy departure from the historic Tochi twins. According to the Scientific American announcement, these twins could stand, but they have not yet succeeded in walking, as each leg is governed by its own brain. The want of correspondence has proved fatal to any attempts in this direction. Since each twin controls one leg with his brain, the conjoined twins failed to walk, having not yet mastered the fluid cooperation necessary to do so. Angelo and Luigi do walk, but not through cooperation. Instead, they have a sort of power-sharing agreement where one twin dominates the action of walking for 1 week at a time. This power-sharing agreement also reveals the underlying antagonism inherent in the twins' distinct personalities. When in control of their legs, Angelo laments to Luigi, "I often consult your wishes, but you never consult mine. When I am in command, I treat you as a guest. I try to make you feel at home. When you are in command, you treat me as an intruder. You make me feel unwelcome." Unlike actual conjoined twins, who overwhelmingly feel comfortable in their conjoinment, Angelo and Luigi appear more like Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, with the personalities existing as intruders, not collaborators in the body. The twins' distinct temperaments form the basis for mutual assistance and, at times, deep antagonism, since Luigi generally manifests dominant characteristics over the more passive Angelo. Speaking to the family at breakfast, Angelo admits, "My brother is hearty, I am not. He is very masculine, assertive, aggressive, I am much less so. I am subject to illnesses, he is never ill." These features can be quite useful, allowing Luigi, for instance, to take medicine when Angelo cannot. And it is only for this reason that Angelo survives the wounds that he received after Luigi and Tom's duel. This fight notwithstanding, Luigi proves to be far more gregarious, while Angelo is more passive and introspective. With these corresponding dominant and passive characteristics, the conjoined twins mirror a distinction known to exist between the hemispheres of the brain, at least since Pierre-Paul Broca's 1861 discovery that the faculties for language lie only in the left hemisphere. Over time, this asymmetry, supported by 20th century split brain experiments with patients whose corpus callosum, that material connecting the two hemispheres, has been severed, solidified into this view that the left hemisphere was dominant in contrast to the more silent, passive right hemisphere. In the 19th century, anxiety about multiple personalities in a single brain were incited by hysteria research, and especially cases of double consciousness. From the first publicized case of Mary Reynolds in 1816, double consciousness, defined as the mind passing by alternation from one state to another, each having the perception of external impressions and appropriate trains of thought, but not linked together by the ordinary gradations or by mutual memory, inspired theories of dual personality in every brain. The British psychiatrist Henry Maudsley, for instance, suggested that the existence of animalistic instincts in the human proved that there was truly a brute brain within the man's. Yet no text provided a more compelling theory of the double brain than Arthur Ladbruk Wigan's The Duality of the Mind. Wigan, a British physician, relied on ongoing physiological research to suggest that the physical structure of the brain corresponded to the mind. Arguing that previous work investigating the physical double brain did not go far enough, Wigan claims the mind is essentially dual, like the organs by which it is exercised. For Wigan, each hemisphere of the brain is a distinct and perfect whole as an organ of thought, thus enabling each to house its own unique personality. Yet these personalities are not only discrete, but they're often antagonistic. Each hemisphere is not only capable of a distinct and separate volition, but he adds, these are very often opposing volitions. As you can see from the top of the cover page here, Wigan is particularly interested in explaining insanity as a result of these dual minds. In the insane, the brute brain overpowers the more civilized one, just as Stevenson's Hyde gradually overwhelms Jekyll. Although Wigan's argument was extreme, even for its own time, it highlights an increasingly accepted view that somehow the structures of the brain was manifested in the operation of the mind. Few writers went as far as Wigan, Gregory Tate explains, but the idea that there was a certain level of division inherent in the human psyche, and that this was somehow tied to the organization of the brain, became more widely accepted as the century progressed. Indeed, Wigan's central idea was that mental duality was not only a symptom of insanity, but rather a universal human experience. Every brain contains two minds, and one is typically dominant over the other. In the healthy individual, Wigan claims, one cerebral hemisphere is superior over the other, and it goes as far as exercising control over the other hemisphere's volitions. When the individual is morally weak or if the brain is damaged, the brute brain can gain a foothold, manifesting the inherent division of the brain by wresting control of some functions from the healthy hemisphere. Again, like Hyde overwhelming Jekyll. Now, Luigi is no Mr. Hyde, but his features in physical appearance and personality are noticeably opposed to Angelo's. Whereas in Pudd'n'head Wilson, the twins are near identical, in Those Extraordinary Twins, the conjoined brothers hardly look related. Angelo is blonde with blue eyes and a light complexion, whereas Luigi is dark-skinned with brown hair. Scholars have noticed the racial prejudice inherent in these remarks, which correspond to not only the racism of post-Reconstruction United States, but also the prejudice in Italy between the lighter-skinned northern Italians and the darker-skinned southern Italians. In Those Extraordinary Twins, such a prejudice causes Aunt Patsy Cooper to judge the twins' personality by their affect, with Luigi's face betraying his inner rebelliousness. Although Rowena, Aunt Patsy's daughter, suggests that both twins' faces show that he is a good-hearted and means well, Aunt Patsy retorts, "I'm not so certain about that. The one on its left, hasn't so good a face, in my opinion, as its brother." Once Rowena affirms that the darker face is Luigi's, Aunt Patsy continues speculating. "Up to all kinds of mischief and disobedience when he was a boy, I'll be bound. I lay his mother had trouble to lay her hand on him when she wanted to. But the one on the right is good as gold, I can see that." Despite the racism that's inherent in Aunt Patsy's prejudice, she does accurately judge much of Luigi's character. He is less considerate towards others, including his conjoined brother, and his violence undergirds much of the action of both Those Extraordinary Twins and Pudd'n'head Wilson, where the trial for assaulting Tom plays a pivotal role in both narratives. If one of the twins resembles the brute brain, it's very clearly Luigi. The twins' differences go beyond physical appearance, however. Each has a unique personality that often stand in opposition to each other, just as Wiggins says of the double brain. Luigi, for instance, is a free thinker, a heavy drinker, and a smoker. Angelo is a Methodist turned Baptist and a teetotaler. Their first night at Aunt Patsy's house is a tableau of difference. Luigi is reading Thomas Paine's argument for deism in the Age of Reason, while Angelo picks up a Protestant devotional, The Whole Duty of Man. When Angelo, who's sick and strangling because Luigi's smoking, begins to sing a hymn, Luigi interrupts with a secular song of his own, and at the end of the night, Luigi swallowed half a tumbler of whiskey, whereas Angelo, whose sensitive organization could not endure intoxicants of any kind, took a pill to keep it from giving him the headache. This tableau highlights their differences throughout the tale. Angelo considers the wishes of his brother, but Luigi does not. Angelo runs for office as a Whig. Luigi opposes him on the Democratic ticket. When Luigi's violence leads him to duel with Tom after the assault trial, Angelo flees the second he gains control of the pair's legs. Clearly, these two dispositions in a single body personify the idea of having two tendencies in one body. If Twain's fictional account demonstrates the conjoined body as a physical representation of a more universal psychological feature, he was not the only one in the 19th century to make this kind of connection. French physician Gabriel Descartes, for example, argues that what exists in conjoined twins, so separate brains, spinal cords, nervous systems in a single body, is actually a more exaggerated depiction of what exists in any human brain. Despite being born with the same hereditary dispositions and being exposed to the same impressions, Descartes argues that the conjoined twins resemble what happens for the two hemispheres of the same brain, and thus they must have had a unique personality. The case is even more profound when you have conjoined twins that are conjoined at the head. In such a case, even a single brain can seem to contain two me's. If this happens with conjoined twins, then even in singleton brains, with their two hemispheres, we could contain multiple personalities, or at least this is the anxiety that inspires work like Wiggins' theory and Stevenson's Gothic fiction. But in Twain's hands, this analogy between conjoined bodies in the human brain becomes not an element for fear, but rather an explanatory principle to complicate readers' understanding of their own psychology. It's therefore no surprise that Twain turns to the image of the conjoined twin in Mental Telegraphy, when he describes those psychological features that cause letters to cross. And yet, one must go on writing, Twain explains, because if you get up from your table and postpone, that other man will do the exact same thing, exactly as if you two were harnessed together like the Siamese twins and must duplicate each other's movements. The physical status of conjoined bodies thus resembles what occurs between two individuals connected via mental telegraphy. In those extraordinary twins, however, the human experience is not merely analogous to conjoined bodies, but is in fact indistinguishable from them. Angelo, for instance, imagines separation from Luigi to be repulsive and unendurable. And privately, he considers everyone else to be monsters and deformities. Those are quotes. For Luigi, it is not that singletons are monsters, but rather that he and Angelo are actually not as different as their conjoined form suggests. Pointing to a consistent 6-month delay between his own growth and Angelo's, Luigi argues that he's actually older than his brother. His hair grew first, he learned to walk and talk first, and he even claims, "The sutures in my skull closed 6 months ahead of his." With this unassailable proof in hand, Luigi states provocatively that the truth is, we are no more twins than you are. This comment functions doubly for Twain. First, it serves as sort of a jab against laboratory psychology because Twain is taking empirical phenomena that are deployed to tell a very particular narrative, despite the more obvious truth that two conjoined twins are in fact the same age. But more provocatively, Twain suggests that even singleton humans might somehow be twinned. Or as John Bird elegantly puts it, quote, "If Siamese twins are no more twins than we are, then either they are not twins or we are." When we consider the dual hemispheric structure of the human brain, this assertion thus suggests that everyone is twinned, at least at a neurological level. Now, as I hope is apparent, I could talk about Twain's analogy between the conjoined twins and the double brain for hours and hours. But now I want to shift towards his more radical move, which is the conjoining of the two stories. The bulk of the plot featuring Angelo and Luigi was, after all, already complete before he met William James in Florence. The decision to revise what Twain calls the refuse matter of those extraordinary twins for publication alongside Pudd'n'head Wilson occurs later in 1894. Yet I suggest that what began as an underlying curiosity for Twain, that is, those contemporary theories of the double brain that are mirrored in the twins, ultimately becomes a guiding principle when the tales are split and then brought back together. In his prefatory narrative of revision, he firmly claims that the tales are essentially different. It was not one story, but two stories tangled together. And they obstructed and interrupted each other at every turn and created no end of confusion and annoyance. Like the personalities of conjoined twins causing strife, the two stories tangled together produced a friction that Twain worries will unseat the reader's reason. He thus resolves to sever the connection. I pulled one of the stories out by the roots and left the other one, a kind of literary Caesarean operation. With the separation complete, Pudd'n'head Wilson could thrive as an independent story, while those extraordinary twins would languish in the background as a postscript where it would no longer derail the straightforward drama of crime and justice. As Twain's explanation goes, publishing those extraordinary twins serves only to satisfy that one reader who would care to know something about the story which I pulled out. Nevertheless, as he continues to clarify in the final remarks, these stories are essentially different. They're essentially discrete. Their story was one story, the new people's story was another story, and there was no connection between them, no interdependence, no kinship. However, Twain protests too much. As we will see, these stories are not only kin, but they're so deeply intertwined that continued conjoinment, not a completed Caesarean, is a better analog for the tales. Our first hint that those extraordinary twins is not wholly severed from Pudd'n'head Wilson appears in the subtitle of the 1894 publication, which describes those extraordinary twins as the suppressed farce. Not a first draft, not an original. Those extraordinary twins is rather the suppressed story. The idea is that both narratives at first coexist, running in parallel, the way that William James describes the multiplicity of immediate experience in the Principles of Psychology. Only later, James claims, does the work of consciousness sift through the experience to form a single stream of thought, suppressing the extraneous material. We see that the mind is at every stage a theater of simultaneous possibilities, James writes, adding that consciousness consists in the comparison of these with each other, the selection of some, and the suppression of the rest by the reinforcing and inhibiting agency of attention. As Twain describes his revision process, he embodies this inhibiting agency when he deems some characters, like Rowena, to be so unnecessary to the dominant story that he proposes just drowning them in a well. Similarly, in a letter to his editor, Twain characterizes his revision as primarily the hiding of the undesirable portion. I have pulled the twins apart and made two individuals of them. I have sunk them out of sight. They are mere flitting shadows now and of no importance. The material of those extraordinary twins is not simply severed through the literary Caesarean operation, but rather it is sunk, it is drowned, it is suppressed, while Pudd'nhead Wilson dominates. By being suppressed, not severed, those extraordinary twins maintains a similar relation to Pudd'nhead Wilson that alternative personalities of double consciousness patients demonstrate towards the dominant self. Suppression, at least since Sigmund Freud's studies on hysteria in 1895, have been closely associated with hysteria patients who intentionally repress, inhibit, and suppress undesired thoughts. In the early Freud, at least, those are all synonyms. A more immediate influence on Twain was the work of Pierre Janet, whose hysteria patient Leonie had 3 distinct personalities. Discussing the case, William James claims that Leonie intentionally suppresses her alternative personalities by attributing their action to delusion. The primary self often has to invent an hallucination by which to mask and hide from its own view the deeds which the other self is enacting. The consequence of this suppression, James later clarifies, is that Leonie 1 knows only of herself, whereas her suppressed personalities, Leonie 2 and Leonie 3, are aware of the existence of others. Now, similarly, Pudd'nhead Wilson makes no direct allusion to those extraordinary twins. But in Twins remains keenly aware of its more dominant counterpart. Chapter 1, for instance, begins by referring back to the original extravaganza, which is presumably the original combined Morgan manuscript, where the 2 tales are still entangled together. Bracketed commentary also transposes narrative material from Pudd'nhead Wilson into the farce, especially at the beginning of chapter 5. In the midst of this bracketed paragraph, summarizing the twins' quarrel, the freethinkers' meeting, and the kicking of Tom, the narrator adds near the bottom, "Then they went to Wilson's house, and chapter 11 of Pudd'nhead Wilson follows." With the greater freedom afforded by its suppression, those extraordinary twins not only knows but also incorporates scenes from Pudd'nhead Wilson to complete its own story. While Pudd'nhead Wilson must maintain strict separation from the material of those extraordinary twins, the latter farce is free to dance between the margins, establishing connections that ultimately undermine the primary story's project of suppression. With these links between the stories, those extraordinary twins effects in narrative form the process of mental telegraphy. Twins receives content from Pudd'nhead Wilson, unsettling claims of singular ownership of the text. This is one of the things that he talks about with mental telegraphy, is that you can no longer have your own material, your own story ideas, because you might have received them from someone else. Exemplar is this note heading chapter 5 of Twins, where the narrator turns to Pudd'nhead Wilson for the story of the kicking of Tom by Luigi at the anti-temperance mass meeting. The same text of chapter 11 of Pudd'nhead Wilson, in other words, plays a role in both versions of the tale. Now, this greatly complicates the text, because in Pudd'nhead Wilson, it's very clear that the kick was perpetrated by just Luigi alone because he's not conjoined in that iteration. In those extraordinary twins, however, the very same kick that's narrated, the very same language that's used, becomes the focus of a contentious assault trial, where the central question is whether or not Luigi alone or the 2 conjoined twins together were responsible for the kick. Significantly, the narrator's language here implies not resemblance, it's not a similar kick, it's the same kick. Chapter 11 of Pudd'nhead Wilson follows. Like an electron in quantum superposition, the kick described in chapter 11 is delivered at once by both Singleton Luigi and by the conjoined twins. And as we read and come upon this bracketed note, we thus must turn back to chapter 11 of Pudd'nhead Wilson, at least in our mind, if not physically, to reread it according to this new information, since now the conjoined twins are undermining the straightforward clarity of chapter 11 in the drama. The result is that we cannot again read Pudd'nhead Wilson without these flitting shadows of those extraordinary twins altering the meaning of the text. I thus claim that these conjoined stories are not therefore sequential as they are printed in a physical text, but rather that they exist as simultaneous narratives that speckle and stain each other. Some critics, of course, argue that such moments reveal Twain's rushed revision, as if he simply forgot to remove some of the references of the twins as conjoined from Pudd'nhead Wilson. The most famous so-called vestigial line is when Tom, just before being kicked, mocks the twins as a human Filipina, which is a term for a nut that contains 2 kernels. "Boys," Tom shouts, "I move that the chairman sit still and lets this human Filipina snip you out of speech." The joke clearly seems to be left in error, as it repeats 2 other references to the twins as a Filipina in those extraordinary twins. Moreover, this joke is nonsensical in Pudd'n'head Wilson because the twins are not conjoined, they're separate. However, and this is often overlooked in the scholarship, Twain did not merely leave this line in, he added it. In the original Morgan manuscript, Tom calls the twins a human pair of scissors, which actually better fits the context of snipping out a speech. So Twain could have left this line in, but in fact he changes it, and in doing so he adds greater ambiguity to chapter 11 while also conjoining the text into 2 parallel stories. A second vestigial moment appears in the prologue of Pudd'n'head Wilson. Here, Twain allegedly wants to assuage the reader's doubts about the legal scenes that are coming up in the text. Since he admits to being ignorant of legal matters, Twain claims to have subjected them to rigid and exhausting revision and correction by a trained barrister, if that is what they are called. As this final hesitation announces, this scrutiny is not honest. William Hicks, the alleged trained barrister, is no expert. Instead, Hicks only studied law part of a while in Southwest Missouri 35 years ago, and he just happens to be in Florence because of his health. Moreover, he's a little rusty on his law, but he rubbed up on it for this book, and those 2 or 3 legal chapters are right and straight now. He told me so himself. Clearly, Hicks's assurance is no assurance at all, and indeed, this endorsement only serves to reduce the reader's confidence in the realism of those legal scenes. And yet, when the reader arrives at the 2 courtroom scenes in Pudd'n'head Wilson, they appear perfectly sound and reasonable. Indeed, the inclusion of physical fingerprint evidence is one of the novel's most noteworthy features. So the ridiculous legal drama that's foreshadowed by this prologue doesn't surface until the courtroom scene of those extraordinary twins, when Luigi stands trial for kicking Tom. As I mentioned earlier, this trial revolves around discerning which of the 2 conjoined twins did the kicking. The trial, already on shaky ground here, devolves into absolute chaos when David Wilson, the twins' lawyer, asks one eyewitness if he was perfectly sure you saw both of them kick, or only one. It's impossible to answer because they're conjoined, and a near slapstick routine follows where Luigi kicks and then the twins kick together, and eyewitnesses are trying to determine who's doing which kick. As this proceeding just devolves into chaos, the reader recalls in that moment the expectation prepared by Pudd'n'head Wilson's prologue. Here, at last, is this ridiculous legal scene drafted by Hicks. These 2 examples show how the narratives, despite Twain's loud claims of their separation, in fact continuously seep into each other. With each tale running in parallel, the narrative functions as simultaneous streams of consciousness that can occasionally bleed into each other. Such streams are not solely the feature of double consciousness in hysteria patients, but a universal human experience. For William James, there exist potential forms of consciousness entirely different from what he calls our normal waking consciousness. He also experimented with nitrous oxide or laughing gas to get to those marginal types of experience. Fellow SPR member Frederick Myers calls these marginal streams subliminal in an essay that was serialized in the SPR's journal between 1891 and 1894, the same time that James and Twain were in Florence. Arguing that recent experimentation had shed scattered and perplexing lights on that part of ourselves which lie below the threshold of ordinary consciousness, Myers suggests that there are, in fact, multiple layers of consciousness below what we consider our normal waking self. Myers' thesis is that the stream of consciousness in which we habitually live is not the only consciousness which exists in connection with our organism. One popular method for interacting with these subliminal streams of consciousness at the time was through hypnosis, a novel 19th century practice with a range of applications from hysteria treatment to stage performance. Researchers discovered that one outcome of the hypnotized state was an acute sensitivity to the hypnotizer's whisper, even in a sea of other noises. Pierre Janet corroborates this finding with his own hysteria experiments, where even when a patient was deep in conversation with someone else, they would nonetheless perform the hypnotized action when the hypnotizer addressed them in a whisper, despite the fact that the patient had no conscious idea that they had received the message. The hypnotic whisper could thus cut through the loudest conversation, tugging on the subliminal expectations and affecting a particular response. Bypassing the dominant talking consciousness, the hypnotic whisper appeals directly to the silent subconscious. Significantly, Twain titles his prologue to Pudd'nhead Wilson as a whisper to the reader, altering what was in the original manuscript, the more straightforward note concerning the legal points. In the original version, where the stories are tangled together, the note simply corresponds to the very same slapstick comedy of the trial that appears in the singular narrative. No whisper is necessary because the expectation is fulfilled in the so-called normal waking consciousness of the narrative, of the story. However, when the scene is severed, indeed suppressed, in the revision, the prologue now functions sort of hypnotically, as a whisper, appealing to alternative narrative stream no longer present in the consciousness of Pudd'nhead Wilson. The text of the prologue is unchanged, so Hicks still undermines the legal credibility of the story, and he still produces the same expectation. However, it is not until the courtroom of twins, in the midst of the townspeople's deafening laughter, when the reader hears the faint whisper with which Twain opened Pudd'nhead Wilson. Those courtroom scenes were civil, but now the influence of the semi-educated, legally rusty Hicks becomes clear. Something similar happens at the end of Those Extraordinary Twins. In the original manuscript, the twins were threatened with execution. This is a whole side thing where Angelo is elected, Luigi is not, but they can't be at the meeting together because one of them's unelected. So they decide, well, we need to execute you, so they go back to Europe, naturally. In the severed tale, Luigi is hanged, and thus dooming Angelo also to death. This revision adds to the farcical nature of Those Extraordinary Twins, of course, but it also recalls back to the story for how David Wilson earned his Pudd'nhead nickname in Pudd'nhead Wilson. There he says he wished he owned half of a noisy neighborhood dog because if he did, he would kill his half. And of course, the neighbors say, well, what did he think would happen to the other half if he killed his half? The answer is obvious, the whole dog would die, but the rhetorical question is unfulfilled until the very conclusion of Those Extraordinary Twins with Angelo's death. Thus, like the other narrative whispers and postponed foreshadowing, this altered ending ties the conjoined brothers back to the drama's titular Pudd'nhead, thus closing another narrative arc. But the narrative does not end with the hanging of Luigi and the conclusion of Those Extraordinary Twins. Instead, Twain appends his brief final remarks, framing the farce as an extravagant sort of tale with no purpose but to exhibit that monstrous freak in all sorts of grotesque lights. In claiming no other purpose, this judgment suppresses the resonance of Luigi's death to Wilson's nickname and the other links between the conjoined stories that survive this literary Caesarean operation. According to these remarks, Those Extraordinary Twins is no more than an expansion of Twain's earlier piece on Chang and Ing, doing nothing more than really poking at the conjoined body. As such, Twain at the end undermines the effects that reading the farce in the margins of Pudd'nhead Wilson has on the reception of both pieces. Like the silent right hemisphere or Wiggins' nefarious secondary mind, Those Extraordinary Twins appears here as a sideshow story to be suppressed and ignored as nothing more than extravagant. Thus, Twain concludes that each story is its own without connection, no interdependence, despite the fact that this sentiment chafes against the reader's immediate experience. The resulting friction, I suggest, serves as a spur to the attentive reader, encouraging a rereading of Pudd'nhead Wilson to trace those interdependences that despite or during the first pass remained largely subliminal. Now, with this focus on rereading, what Pudd'nhead Wilson and Those Extraordinary Twins ultimately deliver is a series of perspectives on a single tale. This requires the reader to practice a different form of literary attention, indeed a more multifaceted form of attention. Here, Twain's tale converges not only with 19th century ideas of the brain, but also more recent work on the dual hemispheric structure of the brain. In his exhaustive study of the science of the double brain, The Master and His Emissary, psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist shows that each hemisphere not only controls particular actions, but each also has its own worldview. He illustrates this with the image of a bird eating a seed. To pick up these tiny seeds, a bird has to focus on a specific task at hand. But at the same time, it must be aware of its environment, to avoid predators and other dangers, while also remaining open to other possibilities, like a potential mate or more food. McGilchrist argues that the brain has evolved to accommodate both forms of attention simultaneously. The left hemisphere attends to focused tasks, while the right hemisphere maintains a more open awareness to the surroundings. People do not see the world as if our eyes are cameras on a swivel, in other words. As McGilchrist claims, this image incorrectly suggests that we choose where we point our attention, and in that respect, we see ourselves as supremely active and self-determining. Instead, there is a more accurate view in which we are already in a relationship with the world, which helps to direct our attention, and which also means that we bring something of ourselves to the process of creating a vision of the world. In other words, the left hemisphere's specific focus does make choices that influence the things that are seen in the world, but the right hemisphere, this more open-ended attention, registers those environmental factors that shift attention and focus ever so slightly. When it comes to language, we know that the left hemisphere contains the so-called toolbox of language, that is, the ability to decipher text as representing concepts and things, but McGilchrist argues that it is actually the right hemisphere which subserves higher linguistic functions, such as understanding the meaning of a whole phrase or a sentence in context, its tone, its emotional significance, along with the use of humor, irony, metaphor, and so on. Reading a narrative requires the understanding of letters and words, of course. This is the domain of the left hemisphere, but it also requires a more open attention to context and nuance, delivered by the right hemisphere. And this establishes connections across the text, or in the case of Twain's conjoined stories, across multiple iterations of the same tale. Thus, I argue that the conjoined Pudd'n'head Wilson and Those Extraordinary Twins function as a literary experiment, a way of engaging both forms of attention, one that's more specific and straightforward, the other that's more subliminal and subconscious. By weaving these threads together, Twain not only produces an entertaining story, but he also plays with how such conjoinment might interact with a reading of the narrative. How might the characters of Pudd'n'head Wilson be influenced by their doppelgangers in Those Extraordinary Twins? Does the suppressed farce render some effect on the fuller drama? Twain doesn't answer these questions for the reader, and indeed his own narrative voice only continues to unsettle his audience with claims that rub against the reader's experience, that these are distinct tales. But the result is a sandbox of material in which the reader must work to make sense of the conjoined narrative. We can simply agree with Twain that the farce has been removed via the literary Caesarean operation and judge the vestigial remnants as the result of poor editing. Alternatively, we might consider the original Morgan manuscript, where the two stories are still tangled together, as actually being the more accurate version of the story. Now we have access to that through the University of California. But by providing the two stories tangled together, not fully separated, but not entirely intertwined, Twain leaves those interpretive decisions up to the readers. He encourages us to engage with our full mental capacity in all forms of attention to make a judgment about the text. What Twain offers his audience in Pudd'n'head Wilson and Those Extraordinary Twins is therefore an exercise in reading. While the story can be read with the straightforward logic of the left hemisphere, this approach leaves the reader with a sense of incompleteness, as demonstrated by Herschel Parker and Henry Binder's famous critique of the text as unreadable because it lacks a satisfying ending. Approaching the text with a more contextual attention of the right hemisphere, by contrast, opens the reader to the range of meaning suggested by the text. The interpretive project then becomes, in Peter Massent's words, quote, a form of collaborative project, as the reader puts together the two together to find one broken whole. Rather than attempting to flatten the conjoined stories into a singular narrative, this latter approach appreciates complex webs of material that Twain compresses between the covers of the book. The unreconciled contradictions that Parker and Binder find unsatisfactory are precisely the features that enable Twain to encourage readers to build new associations between the stories themselves, and by association, between the text and the reader. Any final reconciliation would ultimately revert the conjoined tales back into this singular extravaganza of the original manuscript. But just as the brain has not evolved into one single cerebrum, the text maintains its two discrete parts conjoined in a dual publication. And just as the two competing worldviews of the hemispheres produce an experience of thought as what McGilchrist calls forever in motion, where the brain blurs together the double perspectives into a tentative, single stream of thought, The conjoined stories do the same for the narrative of Dawson's Landing. With the two diverging narratives of Pudd'n'head Wilson and those extraordinary twins, the reader is then thrust into the middle, following whispers and vague connections wherever they may lie, even if complete interpretation must always remain tentative. Twain's conjoined stories thus embody a form of reading that remains in a state of betweenness, tracing many simultaneous streams of narrative without prematurely settling on a dominant perspective. Rather than jump to a resolved synthesis, Twain suggests, it is better to live in that liminal space of uncertainty. Even if not every novel includes a dual publication, Twain reminds us that we, as readers, are always tangled together with our reading. Thank you.